Hello, I hope you're doing okay. So, finding the best way to communicate between Angular components in your app is actually a skill that you need to master. In this video, I'll show you two overall strategies or patterns to achieve that, to ensure seamless communication between your components and do all of this without cluttering your code, your templates, and without adding more boilerplate to your code. So, what we're going to do is we are going to start with a simple example, and there is a header component and there is a contacts component. Now in the header component, we have a search term which the user can use to filter out the contacts. So we need to set this search term whenever it changes from the header to the contacts. So it's a pretty simple scenario of a component communication, but let's see the strategies that we can use. Okay, so the first strategy is the good old inputs and outputs. Now inputs and outputs are an integral part of your component sort of meta, so you can use those to send in data and get data from a component. So in this case, we are going to send the search term as an output from the header. And then we are going to send the search term as an input to the contacts. So let's go to our code now. So our real app here is something like this. I have all of the styles set up and the search term bar actually opens up when you click on this and closes on this. But currently you can see that when I write something, it's not going to filter according to that because there's no functionality. And we have here two components, app header, and then we have app contacts here. Now, the first thing we need to do is to send the search term from the app header. So let's go in your app header and we are going to create a new output. Now we're going to use a new syntax, the modern Angular 18 syntax, and we're going to say search term changed, and let's call this output. This is going to be a type of string. So this is a very simple syntax that has been recently added along with all of the signal based changes. Now this is going to get called when our input field is going to change. So we're going to use the input event for our search field, and then we are going to just simply do search term change emit, and here we are going to send in the current value of the search field which we get from the template variable here. Okay. Now in our app component, we are going to listen for this event. So search term changed, and here we are going to change some value based on this. So let's add a signal here and let's call this search term. This is going to be an empty string initially, but when we get it from here, we are going to set it to the value that we have. We use the event to actually receive or get the value of this output event. Okay, so this seems to be in order. Now we need to send it to the app contacts. So let's go in our app contacts, and you can see that in our app contacts, we have currently a signal of all of our contacts data here. So what we're going to do is first we're going to do an input here. Let's do search term is equals to, going to use the new input syntax, and let's say that we do, or let's give it an initial value of empty here like this. It's going to implicitly work out that it is going to be a string type. So this, we have the signal here. Now what we want to do is to add the functionality to it. We are going to create a filtered contacts computed, and in this computed we are going to add the functionality for this. So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to check if the search term is empty. Now if it's empty, then we are just going to return this dot contacts. So the contacts should remain as they are, but if they're not, then we need to filter it according to the search term. So then we're just going to simply this dot contacts dot c, and we're going to filter it based on that. So we are going to do c dot name. We're going to filter it on the name at this point. Dot to lowercase. We need to normalize it to the lowercase. Dot include. So if the name includes this dot search term dot to lowercase, then that means that we need to. So if the name includes this search term, then we're going to show it. Otherwise, we're not going to show it. All right. So this should work. Let's save this. And here we are going to then also change this contacts that we are using in my contacts list to actually filtered contacts. All right. So this should work. One more thing we need to do is we need to send this search term from here as an input. Great. So now let's test this out. So now when we search it, let's say I'm searching for Gabby, and you can see that it filters in fine. So the inter-component communication is working really good. Now, so what are some of the benefits of this approach, this simple approach? So one of the benefit is that it is simple, and simple things tend to get used more often and they're easier to understand. So this is easier to understand and conceptualize about, and also it works. The problem comes up when we, for example, make it a bit more complex. So if it only has search term, that is fine. Now, but if we, for example, add a sorting functionality here, for example, so then we will need to have another event here, which is going to output the sorting sort of parameter. We're going to have another value here, and then we're going to send the sorting parameter to the app contacts as well and filter the list according to that. Now imagine there are other things as well. Like for example, maybe this has a selection parameter here. And when we select any of these, we want to update the header to the number of selections. We are going to send then an output from the contacts here, and that is going to be get received by the header. So you can see that as our app scales, as we add more functionality to it, you can see that our templates are going to get more messy. They're going to have more inputs and outputs, and they will start to get difficult to follow. So that is a problem, that it does not scale well. But it also has another benefit, and that benefit is that this can be reused. So for example, you can just take in the app contacts and you can put it someplace else, ensuring that it gets the input correct. Then the app contact is going to work fine. So it's not tightly bound to any other thing, so you can actually make it reusable. So you would see then that any component library, like for example, any button that you use, for example, the material race button or any other buttons that you use in component libraries, they always have these inputs in this form because we want to reuse them in different places. This is the primary way that they use to communicate stuff to the component itself. So reusability is a big thing when, for example, you are building such reusable component libraries, or you want a component that you want to use in different places in your app. So if that is the case, then this is the way to go. But anyway, I come back to the problem here. So another problem with this is that it can result in prompt drilling. Now for prompt drilling, I have a very helpful diagram here to explain to you what actually prompt drilling is. Now imagine that you would have a very complex contacts list, and it would have a component as well, and then there has another component within it, then it will have another component within it. This is very common in complex UIs in any real world app that you would come across. But the issue here is that you are passing the search term to this contacts component, and this search term is also needed in the very deeply nested component, the most deeply nested component here. So this needs the input value as well. Now, what would you do if you're just using input and outputs for communication? Now, what you're going to do that is you're going to send the search term here, then you're going to send the search term here, then you're going to send the search term here, then you're going to send the search term here. So in order for this to receive the search term, you need to pass in all of these intermediary in components, and this is going to result in a chain of inputs. All of the inputs in between are basically not needed. The components did not need them, but because the nested one needs them, you are going to send all of these inputs. And this not only looks ugly, so it looks really bad when you have a sort of a nested input series, but also it is more time consuming to implement. So you have to add these unnecessary inputs on each component. Then if, for example, you change it in the future, you'll have to change all of them all at the same time. It's more time consuming for you. So it's difficult to maintain, difficult to implement, just because this nested component wanted this search term. So this is a common problem. It's called prompt drilling. And with the input output pattern, if you use for communication exclusively, you don't use any other pattern, then this issue can come across if your application is anywhere, even moderately complex. So these are some of the pros and cons with using the inputs and the outputs approach, which is seemingly a very simple approach, and I personally really like it, but only if you have a limited number of inputs and outputs. Okay, so an improvement over this would be to actually use model inputs. So if you use model inputs, you would then not need to use outputs at all. Okay, you can just use inputs, and then you can set the value of those inputs because it is a model input. So here, if you change that, we can actually go in my header, and we can make this search term change output to basically search term, and you can make this a model input here, and let's call this as a string. All right, and here then in the input, what we can do is we can just change the value of this search term signal here from the inside of the header component. And then in app component, instead of search term changed, you can actually do search term like this. And then you can bind it to the search term outside, signal outside, all right? So this means that you are going to bind the input and outputs in a single, notation, the banana in the box syntax. And you can refer to my model inputs video if you'd like to get more detail about this. I discuss this in detail and the benefits of this. And I also refactored a UI using model inputs, and I exactly show you how it cleans up your code. So refer to that if you want more detail. But here we are basically combining the inputs and the outputs in one. So this is going to reduce your boilerplate a bit more. So this is an improvement on the input and output, but it's again has the same problems as an input and output. The prop drilling problem remains, the scaling problem remains. So the more data you want to communicate, or share across components, the more inputs you will need to add to your components, and it's going to make your templates look really cluttered. All right. Okay, so this brings us to the sort of the best strategy to use when you have more complex components as you would have in a real world app. And this strategy involves the use of services to actually share data between multiple components, not even two components. You can share data between multiple components really seamlessly. The basic idea is that you would have a service which you can use to store the data which is shared between the components themselves. So what we're going to do is that in our case, since we are storing the search term, let's create a new service and let's see this all in action. So what we're going to do is that we are going to create a service by using ngg service. And in the services folder, we are going to create a new service. We're going to call this a search service. All right. So let's go to this search service. Now in this search service, first of all, we are going to change this provided in root. Now, provided in root means that this service is going to exist sort of at the root of the app. So it is going to be one instance. It's a sort of a singleton available to all of the components in your app. But what we want is that we want to only keep this service specific to a specific sort of component hierarchy or the parent of our component where we need it. So what we're going to do is that we're going to remove this provided in root. All right, that means it needs to be provided explicitly in your component where you want to use it. So the search service, we are going to save your search term here. So we're going to declare a new signal here, and we're going to call this an empty string here. Let's remove the constructor and let's create a function here. Let's call this update search term, and let's say keep the term here. And what it's going to do is it's going to simply do search term dot set and term. So it has an update function which is going to change that shared data or shared state that we want to share among our components. And then it already has that signal which we can actually use in the component that we are reading the shared data. So this search service is now done. Now let's head over to the app component. Now this is our parent component where we actually need this search service, or we actually need the data. So the app header needs this and the app contacts need this. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide this in the providers array here. Let's do search service here. Now this search service is going to get initialized, or it will be one instance of that service along with all of the data within it for this component and for all of the children of this component. If, for example, this was a component itself and you could copy it any place, it would have multiple instances of this search service along with it. So in this case, we are restricting it to the app components. All right. Now, so now we can remove this and this as well. And let's go in app header and see what we need to do. So we are going to use dependency injection in Angular to get the search service in our header component here. So let's do search service, inject, and service here. Now this is the newer way of actually injecting dependencies in an Angular component. The previous way was using it in a constructor. You can use the same and it's going to work the same, but this is a more modern way of doing it. All right. Okay, so about this search term, we don't actually need it then. What we're going to do is that we are going to call search service dot update search term, and we're going to pass in the same value. Great. So now it's going to update the search services search term signal when we write something in our input. Similarly, let's go to the contacts component now. And in our contacts component, then this search term, we can actually, instead of being an input, we can actually just do inject search service dot search term. Now this is the search term in our search service. So we are going to get the data from there. All right. The other functionality, it remains the same. Let's save this and let's try it out whether it works the same. So you can see it filters just in the same way it used to with the inputs and outputs. But now if you go to the app component, you can see that the header and the contacts, the template is really clean, and you can actually go one step further and you can actually just shift all of this filtered contact stuff in the search service as well. And you can make your component truly sort of a dumb component which will only have, the data to display, and it will only take the outputs, in this case the search term. In this case, as it does in the header, it updates the search term. So your components are only going to be doing input and outputs or displaying the stuff that is being passed to it, and the actual business logic, that means the filtering, will be actually part of the search service. So in short, your search service then basically becomes a small store, or a small state manager, just using the power of signals. Now, the benefits of this approach is that it scales really well. So no matter if you have your app as very small, a moderate app, or a very highly complex app, it's going to ensure that your templates remain uncluttered. You don't have that many inputs and outputs, and you can actually have as many data points as you would like, because all of them will be in the component itself, and you're going to get the data from the service that is being used to share the data. Let's look very clean. And then, as I said, you can also convert it into a store so that you can shift the business logic to that store. It makes it easier to test, and it makes your components really dumb, which don't need to add any test for those components. Also, as you can see, it solves the prop drilling problem. Now, if you go back to this diagram here, now if you're not passing the search term here, we can actually just inject the search service right down to this nested component, and you can get that search term right down to this nested component without worrying any of these components with the search term itself. So this elegantly solves the prop drilling problem as well. Now, of course, with pros, there are also cons. So the biggest con here is that it is not reusable. So now our header and our contacts components are basically tightly bound to the search service. Now, if we want to use the header, someplace else in some other app or in some other part of the app, you are not going to be able to use it without the use of the search service. Otherwise, Angular is going to give you an error because it expects a search service inside of it. So this is not really good for when you are making widgets, when you are making reuse components, when you're making presentational components, for example, where you want to use, in different places in your app. So for those cases, it is simple enough. You can continue using the inputs and outputs because of the restriction with reusability, because otherwise your components are going to become tightly bound to services or the store, which you don't want in those cases. Okay, so this strategy is, or this pattern of using a service for communication between components, I've used in quite large apps, and it scales really well. So this is a good strategy to use when you are faced with a more complex, component hierarchy. You have more nested components and you want to communicate seamlessly among them. Okay, so but don't take my word for it. And as I said, that whenever you practice more on real world projects, you are going to find out, and you're going to get that intuitive feeling, about when to use which pattern, in which case, because it's no one size fits all solution. You need to see what your component sizes are, what your component hierarchy is, and what sort of data you are sending among the different components to actually judge and to actually find out which pattern you should use. Now, sometimes you might also need to combine these patterns. So for very simple inputs, you might want to just use inputs, but for the rest of the complex inputs, you might want to use a service to actually share the data among the components. So you can mix and match things if you would like, if it suits your application, but it's all up to you. And as you practice more, you're going to get more intuitive about using the best way. So good luck in building awesome Angular apps using seamless communication among your Angular components. And I hope this video helped you in some way, especially if you're a beginner, to figure out which communication patterns to use among Angular components. And of course, there are other ways of communication as well, such as using routing parameters, but I've skipped those because they really cater to very simple use cases like sending strings and, very simple meters to your components. So I've skipped those, but these two patterns, using input output and using the service as a shared state or shared store, you should know if you are a good Angular developer. So thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please share this video and like and subscribe to the channel. so that it reaches more people like you and it can benefit more people. And I'll see you next time with another interesting video.